Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Steven Brown, and in today's video, we're going to explore another defensive option for the Toronto Maple Leafs that they can maybe acquire. And also, I guess, in doing so, we're also going to take an extensive look at the Chicago Blackhawks and their cap situation for next season. So what's this trade that I teased at the very beginning of the video and the deep dive on the Chicago Blackhawks cap situation? What am I talking about? Well, the Chicago Blackhawks have a defenseman by the name of Connor Murphy, and I believe Lucas Natarino was your name if you're watching this video. You mentioned him the other day, like a couple of people also have in the past, and I wanted to explore the option, is it possible for the Toronto Maple Leafs to acquire this player? And to determine that, we're going to have to analyze the Chicago Blackhawks' cap situation for next season, and we're going to have to explore it in a couple of different ways. So you're going to see there on the screen that the Chicago Blackhawks are projected to have $10.578 million in cap space for next season. But the problem with that is that it's under the assumption that the cap is going to be $84 million. And I think that it's going to stay flat. So the same $81.5 million that it was this season. And if that reigns true, then the Chicago Blackhawks will have just over $8 million to re-sign their expiring contracts. And before we take a look at the potential moves that the Blackhawks can make to improve their cap situation, who are those unsigned players that they need to worry about? And the first one is Dominik Kubalik, who has over 30 goals for them this season before the NHL was put on pause. Another one of them is Dylan Strome, who was almost a point-per-game player for them after coming over in the trade with the Arizona Coyotes last season. Another one of them is Drake Caggiula, not an expensive player, but still a guy that's going to command maybe over $1 million. And the final one is their goaltender, Corey Crawford. I don't know about you, but $8 million is sure not enough money to sign those four players. If I had to just ballpark it and just give like a dirty, messy number here, Alex DeBrincat had $6.4 million for 3 years. There was a bunch of RFAs last season that signed 3-year deals for in and around $6 to just over $7 million. Dominik Kubalik, this is really the first breakthrough season that he's having, so I don't think he would get that much, and I don't think that Dylan Strome would get that much either. But let's say you pencil them both in for $5 million each. I don't think that that's too absurd to say. Drake Caggiula, let's say he signs for the same amount of money. That's $1.5 million. That's $11.5 million. And then whatever contract you negotiate with Corey Crawford, I can imagine him taking a little bit of a haircut, but not that much of a haircut, maybe $3 or $4 million or so. The Blackhawks are really going to need about $15 million or so to sign those four players. But before we move any further, I think it's important to note that I do think that teams are going to be receiving compliance buyouts this offseason, and I think it's due to this line right here, just the wording of it. Due to the 12-13 NHL lockout, the salary cap was not to increase to the projected $70.2 million, so each team was therefore granted 2 compliance buyouts, and I think that's what will happen this offseason. The cap is not going to meet the $84 to $88 million projection that they gave, or it might even go down or stay flat. So I think the teams will be awarded compliance buyouts. And that's important to note because the Blackhawks have a prime candidate for one of those compliance buyouts to be used, and that's on Brent Seabrook. The 34-year-old is going to be 35 at the start of next season, and while he's had a long, storied career with the Chicago Blackhawks, the story of his 2019-2020 season is that he's only played in half the games, and in those half the games, he was either injured or a healthy scratch. So definitely not worth the $6.875 million for the next 4 or 5 seasons after this one, whatever ridiculous contract that he has. So coming over to their projected cap space now after buying out Brent Seabrook with one of their compliance buyouts, that $8 million is now going to be closer to that 15, and that should be enough money to get those players signed. And if we take a look at Connor Murphy's advanced analytics just on the surface, he's a decent defensive defenseman that can also chip in on offense just a little bit. But if we take a look at these numbers here for a little bit more context on those advanced analytics, we can see that he was relied upon to play over 21 minutes a night for the Blackhawks this season, and in a more defensive role as we could see from his zone starts. So I would describe Connor Murphy as a guy who's been playing top minutes, a lot of minutes, defensive-oriented role, and still producing those kind of advanced metrics. Yeah, he's a defenseman that you would want on the Toronto Maple Leafs. But then the question becomes, why would the Chicago Blackhawks trade that away? I mean, they're already thin on the blue line. Why would they deal away Connor Murphy? Well, when the Blackhawks first approached Brent Seabrook about not being a regular in the lineup anymore, I mean, the guy's an assistant captain on this team. He's been there for all the Stanley Cups that they've won. I don't think that Brent Seabrook is just going to sit on LTIR quietly. So there's a possibility that they might not be able to rely upon having Brent Seabrook just sit on LTIR there. And before this whole coronavirus thing, they would have only had $10.578 million under an $84 million salary cap. That wasn't enough to re-sign the players that they need to re-sign. And I mean, they could trade out Brandon Saad and his $6 million a year contract before trading away a guy like Connor Murphy. But if you're looking at Brandon Saad's numbers just on the surface here, he doesn't really have much trade value. Even though he is a 20-goal scorer, there's not many teams out there that just can absorb that $6 million cap hit. And also, he's still kind of a useful player for the Chicago Blackhawks. I mean, he's overpaid, but not by a ton. But this is how I think the Maple Leafs would have gotten Connor Murphy away from them and still kind of can. With or without compliance buyouts. Zach Smith is kind of dead weight for the Blackhawks on their cap, and I think that they would really want to get him off of it. And they could bury a portion of his salary in the minors, but that's not full relief. And you might be saying to yourself, well, why wouldn't they just use the second compliance buyout on Zach Smith? Because, Steven, they were awarded 2 way back when. And they were awarded 1 after the 12-13 season, and then they weren't awarded the second one until the end of the following season. So in this scenario, going into next season, they would only be able to buy out Brent Seabrook if we were following the same stipulations as the last time the NHL awarded compliance buyouts. So we already got the Blackhawks up to about $15 million in cap space or so by buying out Brent Seabrook, and this is again under the assumption that we're going to have a flat salary cap of $81.5 million. If you were to add Zach Smith's total to that, that would bring them up to $18.2 million, and then of course Connor Murphy's $3.85 million, which would leave them with $22 million in cap space going into this offseason with only Drake Caggiula, Dominic Kubalik, Dylan Strome, and Corey Crawford to re-sign. Which we just ballparked it in and around $15 million or so to re-sign those players. That would allow them another $7 million or so to be big players in free agency to make an addition to this team. Now, they could just go the route of just trading Zach Smith to another team in exchange for using one of their compliance buyouts, give them a pick or a prospect or so, and then keep Connor Murphy and still have $18.2 million to work with this offseason. They could easily do that. There's not really an incentive for them to trade Connor Murphy away. But previously to that, when there weren't going to be compliance buyouts and you might not be able to rely upon Brent Seabrook just going on LTIR here, $10.578 million was not going to be enough to re-sign the players that are on expiring contracts for them. So, I mean, if you add Zach Smith's $3.25 million in there and then you add Connor Murphy's $3.85 million in there, $17.6 million is a healthy amount of money to go out and re-sign those players. So before we were in a position to receive compliance buyouts, Connor Murphy was a more feasible guy that the Maple Leafs could target in a trade because the Chicago Blackhawks were in a little bit of salary trouble. When have you heard that before? And then at that point, if there were no compliance buyouts, the Maple Leafs would just take Zach Smith, buy him out, and then you can view Connor Murphy as making $4.93 million instead of $3.85 million, which at that point, he's still worth that much money. But with compliance buyouts more than likely going to be a factor for NHL teams this offseason, I don't think that the Blackhawks have much incentive to trade away a guy like Connor Murphy. But if they still did want to trade Connor Murphy for some reason, I think that taking Zach Smith off their hands would incentivize that a little bit more so, because it would give them more of a cushion to sign their RFAs, get a goalie in there, if not Corey Crawford, and then maybe be a player in free agency. And if we take a look at an armchair GM that I made a couple of videos ago, I will link that video atop the screen if you're interested to see the rest of the explanation for everything going on here. Connor Murphy does work. It still allows you to have a couple of players on the bench. It still allows you to have Travis Dermott in there, and there's $78,000 of cap space under the assumption that the cap is going to stay flat. But what would the trade for Connor Murphy and Zach Smith be? Obviously, taking Zach Smith would soften the acquisition cost of Connor Murphy a little bit, but the Maple Leafs, as you can see here, the players on LTIR are players that the Maple Leafs could offer in a trade, some draft picks, some prospects. I think that they could get that deal done. But nonetheless, he would be a pretty sizable improvement on what the Maple Leafs have on their blue line right now, and he was an option being discussed before the trade deadline. He was an option being discussed in my comment section, so I thought I would make a video exploring the situation. But I'm still more in favor of doing something like this, signing a UFA defenseman like Dylan DeMello or Justin Braun for $2.5 to $3 million for 2 or 3 seasons. I think that they're effective players, and it would allow the Maple Leafs with a little bit more room to have players on their bench, to spend a little bit more money up front to replace guys like Alexander Kerfoot and Andreas Johnsson, and still have Travis Dermott and Timothy Liljegren, plus the assets that they would get for dealing away Kerfoot and Johnsson. But again, if you want a deeper look at what's going on here on the screen right now, I did an entire video explaining absolutely everything here. So I will link that above the screen and it will be featured at the end of this video. So make sure to leave me a like on this video if you did like it and subscribe for more, because more is always on the way, guys. Thank you again so much for 500 subscribers, and I will talk to you again really soon.